The beginning of the Kutai kingdom, Kudunga, a wise tribal chief, stood in a fertile valley on the banks of the Mahakam River. Surrounded by dense forests and green rice fields, he looked into the distance with an expression full of hope. In the sky, birds flew freely, creating a peace that enveloped nature. At a small pier on the banks of the Mahakam River, merchant ships from India with white sails docked. Indian merchants wearing traditional Indian clothing dialogued with Kutai residents. Local residents in traditional Kalimantan clothing greeted them enthusiastically. In a simple bamboo hall in the middle of the forest, an Indian Brahmin sat cross-legged, teaching Hindu teachings to Kudunga and his advisors. The smoke of incense flowed through the air, and the sound of mantras could be heard all around. On a hill overlooking the valley, Kudunga stood looking at the setting sun. The sound of the flowing river accompanied his thoughts about the future of his new tribe, while the breeze brushed his face. The people gathered in the open field, listening to Kudunga's announcement. Cheers filled the air when Kudunga declared himself the first king, and his people celebrated with dancing and singing. Aswawarman, the beginning of the Hindu dynasty. In the throne room made of wood, Kudunga sat with Aswawarman. Kudunga spoke firmly, giving wise advice about the responsibilities of a king to his son. Outside, the sun was setting over the Mahakam River. The royal square was full of people who saw Aswawarman perform the Aswamedha ritual. A white horse was released and chased, a symbol of the power and sovereignty of the kingdom. People cheered happily watching this great ceremony. In a small temple on the river bank, the Brahmins performed a worship ceremony. The sound of their mantras filled the air with tranquility, and the smoke of incense was strong. Aswawarman and the royal family prayed to Lord Shiva. Aswawarman led the troops with courage, through the dense forest towards the border. The sound of soldiers' footsteps and birds singing accompanied their journey. They prepared defenses to expand the kingdom's territory, peak of glory in the Mulawarman period. In the large royal throne room, King Mulawarman sat with authority. He listened to reports from his advisors about the booming trade in the kingdom, with the sound of flowing water from the river accompanying him. The market on the banks of the Mahakam River was filled with traders from various countries. Mulawarman walked among them, greeting his people. Silk clothes from India, spices and gold exchanged hands, creating a busy and prosperous atmosphere. A large altar was erected in the middle of the forest for offerings to Lord Shiva. Brahmins dressed in traditional Hindu clothing chanted prayers fervently. Mulawarman stood near the altar, offering 20,000 cows as a symbol of generosity. The large wharf on the Mahakam River became a center of trade. Large ships with white sails anchored, loaded with goods such as spices, gold and silk. Merchants from all over the world transacted enthusiastically. Trade and community life. The floating market on the Mahakam River looks busy. Small boats transport agricultural produce, fish and spices. Traders in distinctive clothing bring goods from far away, creating a colorful scene. At the temple construction site, workers were busy carving large stones. Brahmins and architects discussed Indian-inspired temple designs. Carving tools rang, and dust rose in the air. In the learning hall near the temple, the royal children sat intently. The Brahmins taught the Pallava writings and holy scriptures. The atmosphere was silent, only the sound of prayers and instructions could be heard. The decline of the Kutai kingdom, King Mulawarman sat pensively on his throne. He listened to reports from his advisors stating the threat of a new kingdom coming to seize his territory. The atmosphere became heavy, with the sky starting to get cloudy outside. At the kingdom's border, the Kutai soldiers prepared with weapons in hand. They were planning a strategy to face attacks from the Kutai Kartanagara Sultanate. The sound of soldiers' footsteps could be heard along the defense line. The envoy from Kutai Kartanagara stood before King Mulawarman. With a cold expression, the envoy conveyed the demand to hand over the territory. The atmosphere in the royal hall was tense, with the people silently observing the meeting. People began leaving their villages, carrying simple belongings on boats. Their journey was accompanied by feelings of anxiety and sadness, leaving behind a once prosperous land. Eternal traces of history. In the middle of the forest, a Brahmin stood in front of the Yupa stone. Carefully, he carved the last inscription that tells of the glory of the Kutai kingdom. The sound of the chisel and the scratching of the stone could be heard clearly. At the site of the Yupa site, a group of modern archaeologists in all white clothes are wiping away the dust from ancient inscriptions. They are taking careful notes, trying to understand the history hidden in the stones. A historian stands in front of the Yupa stele in the museum. explaining to visitors the story of King Mulawarman and the glory of the Kutai kingdom. The spotlight illuminates the stele behind him. A local family was walking in the Kutai site area in Muara Cayman. They looked at the ancient inscriptions that told the story of their ancestors with pride and curiosity. In a school classroom, a history teacher was passionately telling the story of the Kutai kingdom to his students. On the blackboard, the picture of King Mulawarman and the Yupa inscription were clearly drawn. Conclusion and reflection. On the road to the Kutai site, a large panorama shows the remains of temples and inscriptions. Several people stand admiring the relics of the past that still stand strong, even though the kingdom has long since collapsed.